Hey, what's up, G fans? It's my first Godzilla section of the new year, 2016. We made it one step closer to the new Godzilla movie in July, and I am here doing the latest Godzilla dissection. This is the 28th episode. There's only two more after this one, and this is where I delve into basically my top three Godzilla movies I love of all time. And for this edition, I'm doing none other than Mothra vs. Godzilla, released in 1964, also known as Godzilla vs. Thing, in North America and many other locations, I believe, but mainly the US. This is my top Godzilla films, most definitely. Probably one of the best, not just the show series, but the entire franchise as a whole. It's number three on my personal top 10 list, right after Godzilla vs. Destroyer and Gojira. Uh, it's a great work of classic cinema in general, and not just a Japanese giant monster movie or Kaiju film. It was the last Godzilla movie before his transformation to a complete hero, and worse in the 70s, a child star, as we all know. After this movie, it wouldn't be for another 20 years in 1984's Return of Godzilla that the Monster King would go back to his roots of being, a symbolic destructor. I'm not saying I didn't enjoy some of the movies from the late 60s and 70s. After all, I highly enjoyed Terror of Godzilla, and I absolutely adore Ghidorah, the Head Monster, and Destroy All Monsters. However, none of those hold the same weight as this movie, which honestly comes out of all the Showa films, and there's a whole 15 of them. This is the one that comes the closest to getting the vibe of the 1954 film. And even then, it's so different in its own ways, which is pretty freaking good. Where to start? I guess you could say for the most part, it was realistic and didn't have any, overly ridiculous storylines for a Godzilla film. And it was doing something fresh for the genre at the time, that this was basically a crossover movie taking Mothra, who had basically just appeared 3 years earlier in her own solo movie, 1961, and combining it with one of the Toho's biggest hits at the time, Godzilla, who just was fresh off his crossover with King Kong, America's top monster. So business-wise, it only made sense. Next year, they'd go even further with Godzilla Rodan and Mothra in one movie against King Ghidorah. So that's just basics right behind the movie. And like I said, it's fairly realistic. It doesn't involve aliens or anything like that. It's a lot of focus on human characters and the motivations behind them, both good and bad. And that's what really drives the movie and what makes it so freaking great. One of the best things about this movie, other than just relatable human protagonists, are the antagonists. These are some of the best human antagonists that the movie basically ever seen. They're not overly, over the top evil. They're basically just bad businessmen who basically there to exemplify the corporate greed. And this is basically building on what we saw in King Kong vs. Godzilla, was more of a comedic satire of the whole Japanese business industry. Here, it's just a straight up, these guys are greedy and they'll do whatever it takes to make a profit at expense of, everything else around them, including eventually turning on each other. And to me, that was just a very good freaking way to do the human antagonist. They're not alien invaders. Uh, they have their own moments of comedic effect, which makes them enjoyable to watch on screen. But they definitely serve as great antagonists. If I had to say one thing about them, I know some people watch the movie usually complain that the human antagonists seem to die about like the before the actual climax of the movie. People usually say it takes a dip after the human uh, villains are killed, and then Godzilla fights the Mothra larva, which by some people in the modern era rated down. But to me, it's just fine what they did because at that point the human antagonists had served their purpose. The egg of Mothra was already, in the in the foreground of the action with Godzilla arriving and off the hotel scene. So there's no reason for the villain's storyline to continue any further after that. The focus at that point is solely on Godzilla. So I think they had I think their death scene was perfectly fine the way it was done. and that includes to me the timing of when it was done. We don't need to have them fighting at the very end, the protagonist, because by then at the actual climax, it's purely Godzilla versus the children of Mothra, and that's where the focus should be. So to me, yeah, not a complaint for me. The message is pretty clear, and that's greed never prevails. The first movie was all about the anti-nuclear allegory, and it's still there, but only very subtly. I mean, after all, Geiger counter alerts the characters to Godzilla's location right before he awakens. But there's another message in here that I think is pretty freaking relevant to this day, and it's basically mentioned on the scene on Infant Island, where Infant Island, if you don't know, is the basically the I guess you would say the home of Mothra, where the people of Infant Island also worship her. And this basically was built upon a 1961 film that Infant Island was irradiated the crap out of by nuclear test, and so the people are mostly sick and frail. And so, as part of the whole radioactive mission still being there, however, another much more important message is built in that scene, where I think it was Kira Takarada's character basically brings up the whole need for all nations to unite and stop being against one another. The movement towards a brotherhood of men. And that was just a freaking great moment for me. And that's one of the many points of the movie, besides nuclear terror, besides corporate greed, the need for mankind to unite, something that mankind is, getting closer and closer towards, but still not fully realized. We still have many conflicts to this day. So to see a movie touching on that whole thing is very interesting indeed. And driving all this home, is just some of Toho's greatest actors. We have Kira Takarada and Jun Tazaki, as well as Hiroshi Kazumi. And we also have the beautiful Yuriko Hoshi, who would star in the 2000 film Godzilla vs. Megaguirus. These actors do a great job portraying great protagonists, but also is the occasional comedic scene which actually blends in, but does not, comedy is not shown to the monsters in this movie at all, which is actually a step up from King Kong versus Godzilla, where, like I said, more satire and bits of comedy shown through King Kong and Godzilla at times. So the human monster balance to me it was done very well, magnificent. If you didn't know, of course, the first, I believe, like almost entire Showa series, except for maybe the last two Mechagodzilla movies, were written by Shinichi Sekizawa, and this is basically one of his best scripts he ever wrote for the original series of Godzilla films. Really well done. Uh, Now to the monsters. Godzilla's role in this film is very similar to his role in the first film. He's an unstoppable terror who walks the earth to remind humans of the mistake of playing with the fire of the god, as one character calls it, which was great. And I must say, this is one of my favorite versions of Godzilla, just overall. Uh, I would put this up here with Burning Godzilla and my 2002/2003 Godzilla design for just one of the best freaking looking versions of him of all time. His eyes are powerful and imposing, and the spikes on the back of the head are a nice touch. There's no touch of campiness in his movements or attacks. He feels very natural, and he just looks great. The tail length is just right. The spines look great. Texture of the skin, that epic cold stare. They just really nailed this movie. Godzilla is just an incredible, unstoppable force of nature in this movie, and they really bring that home.